It was early November when I found myself at the Sandstone Motel, a crumbling relic stranded on a desolate stretch of desert highway. I had been driving for hours, the desert swallowing me whole in its vast, unyielding silence. The motel's flickering neon sign felt like salvation at first glance, a promise of rest and respite from the monotony of the open road. The receptionist was a gaunt man named Roger, whose monotone voice matched the peeling wallpaper behind him. His eyes darted nervously as he slid a key across the counter to me. "Room 8, he said. "End of the hall. Don't disturb the door next to yours. It's out of service." I raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong with it?" "Maintenance issue," he replied too quickly. His gaze dropped to the scratched countertop. I wanted to press further but thought better of it. I was too tired for small-town weirdness. With a nod, I took the key and headed to my room. The hallway was dim, lit by a single buzzing fluorescent light. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. Room 8 was at the far end, directly next to the door marked with an out-of-order sign. Inside, my room was as dismal as expected. A stained carpet, a sagging mattress, and a decades-old TV perched precariously on a rickety stand. But it was quiet, and that was all I needed. As I unpacked my overnight bag, I noticed something peculiar. Faint scratches on the adjoining wall, as though someone had repeatedly dragged something sharp against it. They were barely noticeable in the dim light, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I shrugged it off. Old building, old damage. Nothing worth losing sleep over. It started around midnight. A soft, rhythmic tapping came from the out-of-service room next door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just the natural creaks and groans of an aging building. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. I turned off the TV and pressed my ear to the wall. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was too precise to be a rodent or faulty plumbing. It was as if someone, or something, was knocking in a pattern, waiting for an answer. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and hesitated before calling the front desk. Roger's voice was groggy when he picked up. "Yeah? This is room 8. There's a noise coming from next door," I said, keeping my voice low. There was a long pause. "There shouldn't be. That room's empty." "Well, something's making noise in there. I'll check it out in the morning." "Morning? What if—" He hung up. Frustrated and uneasy, I tried to ignore the noise. I turned the TV back on, hoping the sound would drown out the tapping. But the volume only seemed to agitate it. The tapping became scratching, a horrible scraping sound that made my teeth clench. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my room key and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was colder than before, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. The buzzing light overhead cast long, trembling shadows. I stood before the door marked "out of order." My pulse quickened as I reached for the doorknob, half expecting it to swing open on its own. It didn't. Locked. "Hello?" I called softly, pressing my ear to the door. For a moment there was silence, then faintly, a child's voice whispered, "Help me." I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Who's in there?" I demanded, louder this time. No response. I ran back to my room and grabbed my phone, intending to call the police, but I hesitated. What would I even say, that I heard a ghostly whisper in a broken-down motel? They'd think I was crazy. Instead, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I returned to the door, armed with a sturdy metal hairpin I'd found in my bag. Years of fiddling with broken bike locks in my youth paid off. The lock clicked open with a sickening finality. The room beyond was dark, the air inside colder than the hallway. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, revealing a scene that froze me in place. The walls were covered in scratch marks, deeper and more erratic than the ones in my room. The bed was stripped bare, the mattress stained with something dark and crusted over. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, its back to me, and then I saw it, a faint outline of a figure sitting in the chair. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Slowly, I approached, my flashlight shaking in my grip. As I circled the chair, the light revealed an old, decayed mannequin dressed in tattered clothes. Its face was cracked porcelain, its mouth fixed in a grotesque grin. Relief washed over me. It was just a stupid mannequin, a cruel prank or some sick joke. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the whisper. "Help me." This time it was right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. The mannequin still sat lifeless in the chair. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. That's when I noticed something else, an old, faded photograph tucked under the mannequin's hand. I pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was a black and white family portrait, parents and a young boy smiling brightly. The boy looked familiar, though I couldn't place why. Then it hit me. He was the same boy from a faded missing persons poster I'd seen on the motel's bulletin board in the lobby earlier that evening. My chest tightened as I tried to make sense of it. What was his picture doing here? The mannequin's head snapped toward me, its porcelain eyes gleaming in the flashlight beam. Before I could think further, the door behind me slammed shut. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in my panic. It finally gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, my heart pounding. The buzzing fluorescent light above flickered wildly as I raced back to my room. The scratching returned, louder this time, coming from all around me. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor. It was as if the motel itself had come alive, hungry and restless. I grabbed my bag and fled the motel without looking back, the eerie whispers still echoing in my ears. When I was safely back on the highway, I pulled over, trying to calm my shaking hands. My pulse thundered in my ears, but even over that I swore I could still hear the faint whispers. I never went back to the Sandstone Motel. A week later, driven by unease I couldn't shake, I searched for it online. Buried in the results was an old news article from nearly a decade ago. A family had disappeared while staying at the motel. Their room was left in chaos, as if they'd been interrupted during the night. The parents were found days later in the woods nearby. Their deaths ruled suspicious but unsolved. The boy, however, was never found. I stared at the grainy photo accompanying the article. The family from the black and white portrait. The boy's smiling face now sent a chill down my spine. Why was his picture in that room? And what did the mannequin have to do with any of this? Even now, I don't know what I saw that night. But sometimes, in the quiet moments just before sleep, I hear it. The faint scratch of nails against wood, a whisper too low to make out. And always, the sense of eyes watching me from the shadows. I try to remind myself that some doors are meant to stay locked, some whispers left unanswered. But the boy's face lingers in my mind, as if he's waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. If this is your first time here, welcome. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our spine-chilling stories. Your support means the world to us. Share these thrilling tales with your friends and family. Thanks for being a part of our journey. December brought frost and silence, wrapping the Pine Hollow Motel in an eerie stillness. Nestled on the edge of a forgotten highway, it was the kind of place where people came and went without fanfare, a refuge for the weary, the overlooked, and sometimes the desperate. I'd worked as the night manager here for 3 years, long enough to recognize every creak in the floorboards and every flicker of the aging neon sign outside. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Most nights were quiet, with the occasional traveler checking in or a guest grumbling about the vending machine eating their dollar. I'd pass the time flipping through old crime novels or watching reruns on the tiny TV in my office. The motel had its quirks: peeling wallpaper, a faint mildew smell in the rooms no matter how hard we scrubbed. But it also had a strange charm, the kind that made people feel like they could vanish here, even if just for a night. It was a Tuesday evening when they arrived, a family of 3, father, mother, and a little boy, no older than 4. The man looked wiry and worn, his face shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that only long drives and sleepless nights could bring. The woman, petite and soft-spoken, carried the boy on her hip. He clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly to his chest, his wide eyes scanning the dimly lit lobby with quiet curiosity. "We'll take a room for the night," the man said, placing cash on the counter. His voice was low and steady, but his eyes kept darting to the door as if he expected someone to burst through at any moment. "Room 7, I said, sliding the key across the counter. "End of the hall. Let me know if you need anything." The man nodded, scooping up the key. The woman offered a faint smile before following him down the hall. As they walked away, I caught the boy glancing back at me, his expression unreadable. The next morning, Carmen, the housekeeper, came to restock the supply closet. She was humming softly as she worked, her hands moving deftly between towels and bottles of cleaner. "New family in room 7? She asked, glancing at the roster. "Yeah," I replied, sipping my coffee. "They seem normal enough." Carmen chuckled. "Normal doesn't mean anything around here. You remember that guy last month? Seemed normal too, right up until he trashed the room and bolted." I laughed along, but her words stuck with me. The Pine Hollow had a way of attracting strange characters, though most stayed under the radar. Still, something about this family lingered in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. By evening, the father came to the desk to ask about local places to eat. I suggested the diner down the road, but he shook his head. "We'll just grab something from the vending machines," he said, his voice clipped. His hand rested on the boy's shoulder, holding him close. I watched them walk back to room 7, a nagging unease settling over me. The following morning, Carmen banged on my office door, her face pale and drawn. "It's the family in room 7, she said breathlessly. "The boy is gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "They woke up and couldn't find him," she explained. "They're panicking." I hurried to room 7, where the mother was sitting on the bed, clutching the stuffed rabbit like a lifeline. Tears streamed down her face and her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The father paced the room, his movements frantic. "We've looked everywhere," he said, his voice cracking. "The parking lot, the woods, he's just gone." I immediately called the police. The minutes dragged like hours until the first patrol car arrived, red and blue lights flashing against the dull gray sky. As the officers questioned the parents, I reviewed the motel's security footage. The cameras weren't great, old and grainy, but they covered the parking lot and hallways. Around 3 a.m., the footage showed the boy leaving room 7, clutching his rabbit. His movements were slow and hesitant, like he wasn't entirely sure where he was going. Then, just outside the back exit, the screen flickered. "Stop there," one of the officers said, leaning over my shoulder. The footage showed a shadowy figure near the exit, a man, tall and thin, his features obscured by the poor lighting. He lingered for a moment before leading the boy out of view. My stomach churned. Someone had taken him. The police began questioning every guest at the motel, but one stood out, a young man named Eric who'd checked into room 5 2 nights earlier. He was quiet and polite, the kind of person you wouldn't look at twice, but his answers were vague and his hands trembled slightly when he spoke. "Eric," the officer said, his tone sharp. "Where were you around 3 a.m.? "In my room, sleeping," Eric replied, avoiding eye contact. "Mind if we take a look inside?" Eric hesitated, then nodded. When the officers entered his room, I stayed outside, my heart pounding. Moments later, one of them emerged, his face grim. "We found something," he said. Inside, they discovered a backpack filled with disturbing items, maps with marked locations, photos of children clipped from newspapers, and a notebook filled with chilling notes. Eric was taken into custody immediately, and under intense questioning, he confessed. He had lured the boy outside by tapping on the window and whispering promises of candy. His plan was to take the child to an abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The police wasted no time. Using the location Eric provided, they organized a search. Hours later, they found the boy, huddled in the corner of the cabin, clutching his rabbit. He was cold and frightened, but otherwise unharmed. When the boy was reunited with his parents, the relief was palpable. The mother collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably as she held him. The father thanked the officers over and over, his voice thick with emotion. Eric was arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abduction. As he was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at the motel with an unnervingly calm expression, as if he didn't regret a thing. The family left the next morning, their car disappearing down the highway. But the motel didn't feel the same after that. The walls seemed to hold the echoes of what had happened, and every shadow felt a little darker. I couldn't stop thinking about Eric. How ordinary he had seemed when he checked in, how polite and unassuming. It was a stark reminder that evil often hides in plain sight, and danger can come from the most unexpected places. You can never truly know someone, no matter how harmless they appear, and sometimes even the quietest places conceal the darkest secrets. The motel loomed in the distance like a shadowy specter on the side of the highway. Its neon sign flickered erratically, the word vacancy buzzing like a dying insect. After 9 hours of driving through endless stretches of barren road, my body ached and my nerves were frayed. I had no energy to search for another place. This was it, the only refuge for miles. The Sandpine Motel wasn't much to look at. Its peeling paint revealed layers of neglect, the windows were smeared with grime, and the parking lot was dotted with potholes. A single bulb above the office door cast a weak, yellowish glow, drawing swarms of moths like a beacon of decay. I grabbed my overnight bag and stepped inside the office, the bell above the door jingling weakly. Behind the counter stood a man with a gaunt face and deep-set eyes that didn't quite meet mine. His name tag read Walt. "Room for the night?" I asked, keeping my voice steady despite the unease prickling at the back of my neck. He hesitated, his lips curling into what might have been a smile or a grimace. "Just one room left, end of the hall." His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Quiet spot. Nobody'll bother you there." I handed over cash, trying to ignore the way his fingers lingered a beat too long when he passed me the key. "Room 12, he said, his gaze darting to the clock on the wall. "Lock the door tight, and if you hear anything strange, just ignore it." I opened my mouth to question him, but he'd already turned away, disappearing into a back room. Room 12 was as dismal as I expected. The walls were painted a sickly beige, with patches of discoloration from water damage. The bedspread looked like it hadn't been replaced since the 80s, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Dropping my bag on the bed, I went to the bathroom to splash some water on my face. That's when I noticed it. The mirror over the sink was tilted, revealing a darkened corner where the glass didn't quite meet the frame. It wasn't broken, just off. Brushing it off as a quirk of the rundown building, I returned to the bedroom and collapsed on the bed, too tired to care about anything else. But sleep didn't come easily. Somewhere outside, the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the stillness, stopping just beneath my window. I froze, my ears straining to pick up more. When the sound didn't repeat, I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind, maybe a stray animal. I closed my eyes again, though unease gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. When I woke hours later, the digital clock on the nightstand read 3:16 a.m. My bag, which I'd left zipped and upright, was lying open on the floor, its contents spilling out. A cold sweat prickled my skin. I could have sworn I'd zipped it shut. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I'd forgotten about the bag in my exhaustion. But as I left the room to grab a coffee from the vending machine in the lobby, I noticed something else. The chair by the window had moved. Not much, just a few inches to the left, but enough to make my pulse quicken. Returning to the room, I inspected the lock. It seemed intact, but I slid the deadbolt and secured the chain just to be safe. By noon, I was considering leaving, but fatigue and the thought of another long drive made me hesitate. Instead, I ventured into the office to ask Walt for directions to the nearest diner. The office was empty. I called out, but no one answered. A guest ledger sat open on the counter, its pages yellowed and curling at the edges. Out of curiosity, I flipped through it. The last name scrawled on the page was mine. The entry before that? Over a week old. When Walt finally emerged, his face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Fine," he replied quickly, too quickly. "Anything you need?" I asked about the diner, but his vague directions didn't make much sense. He avoided looking at me directly, his eyes flicking to the clock and then back to the hallway behind him. I didn't push. That night, the noises started again. At first, it was the faint creak of footsteps outside my door. Then came the whispering, muffled, indistinct, but undeniably there. I held my breath, listening. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft scratching sound. It was coming from the adjoining wall. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The scratching stopped. A cold draft swept through the room, though the windows were shut tight. My heart raced as I scanned the shadows, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But then I saw it. The chair by the window was facing me now, its position completely reversed. I bolted for the door, fumbling with the deadbolt and chain. As I stepped into the hallway, I caught a glimpse of movement at the far end, a figure disappearing around the corner. I chased after them, desperate for answers, but when I rounded the corner, the hallway was empty. Returning to my room, I found the door ajar despite locking it before leaving. Inside, the bedspread had been stripped and the word "leave" was scratched into the headboard. Panicked, I grabbed my bag and headed for the car. As I passed the office, I saw Walt standing behind the counter, his expression vacant. "You shouldn't have stayed," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded. He didn't answer. His eyes were hollow, his face devoid of emotion. I didn't wait for an explanation. I jumped into my car and sped away, the neon vacancy sign flickering in my rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I realized something chilling. My phone was missing. I hadn't taken it out of the room, yet it wasn't in my bag. The next day, I searched for information about the motel online. What I found made my blood run cold. A police report about a series of disappearances, all connected to the Sandpine Motel. The most recent was dated just 3 days before I arrived. I never went back, but sometimes, late at night, I hear faint scratching at my bedroom wall, and I wonder if I truly escaped.